Our next live stream event is Tuesday, March 11th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 p.m. Pacific. I will be hosting a live discussion with Howie Singer and Bill Rosenblatt, co-authors of the engaging and informative book Key Changes, The 10 Times Technology Transformed the Music Industry. This is another free event, but we ask that you register in advance by visiting the link in our show notes or at thetonearm.com. Your registration includes an opportunity to win a signed copy of the book. See you there. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping music, arts, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on Cary Baker, author of Down on the Corner, Adventures in Busking and Street Music. That music you hear on street corners and subway platforms has its own untold history. And at age 16, Cary Baker followed a slide guitar's haunting melody through Chicago's Maxwell Street Market to find himself face-to-face with bluesman Blind Arvella Gray. That chance encounter sparked a lifelong obsession. Cary's book, Down on the Corner, traces the heritage of street music across 100 years, from blues legends in the 1920s to modern-day buskers armed with QR codes. He's spoken with everyone from Lucinda Williams to Billy Bragg about their days playing for tips, revealing how many music careers began with nothing more than an open guitar case. The streets have always been America's most democratic stage, where doo-wop harmonies, folk ballads, and raw blues first reached public ears. Cary's book captures the vital tradition in all its gritty, authentic glory. And now, Cary Baker. I would love it if you could tell our audience about how you initially came to become interested in this topic of sort of street musicians and street music, and the early artists that sort of sparked this for you.
I grew up in Chicago area, in the suburbs of Chicago. Pretty middle-class existence, really. I never saw a street singer in Wilmette, Winnetka, Glencoe. My father one day, he being the son of Eastern European immigrants, wanted to show me a street called Maxwell Street in Chicago. It's where his parents used to take him. It was a flea market, and his parents used to take him there to buy, to sell, to trade. I think there was a sense of community there, and he wanted to show it to me. He assured me I'd only want to see it once. So we parked the car over by the University of Illinois, walk across Roosevelt Road, and the first thing I hear is slide guitar, and not just slide guitar, but slide guitar against metal on metal. It was just a tone I'd never heard before. And we followed the music and eventually found a blind, black, older street singer with a Dixie cup safety pin to his lapel, and he was singing a very long version of the folk blues traditional song called John Henry. And he was adding lyrics to it about Maxwell Street and nearby Halsted Street. It was very intriguing, and he went on forever. He figured the people were probably just passing him by, so the song went on, and when he finally took a break, I introduced myself. I was only 16 years old. I had a radio show on my high school FM radio station, a blues program, and I knew a little about blues, and I was very intrigued. So I got his phone number, and I called him up in the next week or two, and I asked if he could do an interview, and I did one. I happened to be walking by the Northwestern University campus and picked up a new publication that I hadn't seen before. I think it had just started, called the Chicago Reader. It's fairly new. This was first or second edition. I thought this could be a good home for my story about this blind street singer. So at age 16, I typed up a story based on the interview, using my best instincts about writing, and sent it in with a stamped envelope to the Chicago Reader, downtown Chicago, and lo and behold, the next time I walked by the Northwestern campus, there it was in print. So it was my first article, really. I went to his house, and I interviewed him further for Living Blues magazine. By now, I'm really into blues and reading the magazines. I found out that he had a sister who's also a street singer, and I interviewed her as well. And before you know it, not only did I want to see Maxwell Street more than once, I was going just about every Sunday I possibly could. And there were many street singers. I mean, this was the end of the era, clearly, but I was just old enough and there soon enough to see Maxwell Street Jimmy Davis, who had made an album for Elektra Records, Little Pat Rushing. Anyway, I was very intrigued with street singers. And I ended up producing an album by Arvella Gray, the guy with the metal slide guitar. picked him up at his apartment, took him to the south suburbs. We recorded all night for a little label that was better known for old-time country music, but made an exception when I told him about this guy. So the album came out. I was responsible for bringing the artist to the label. Later on, I reissued the record on my own CD. I started a label just to reissue this recording, to preserve it in the CD era. So I really kind of made this guy my project. Now, I majored in journalism at Northern Illinois University. I graduated, and by now I'm kind of a brand name freelance writer, not the biggest, but I was working. And I get a call from a punk new wave magazine in New York called Trouser Press asking me, is Milwaukee anywhere near Chicago? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Why? What do you need? And they told me about a band that had just been signed to Slash Records called Violent Femmes. And they told me that the thing about this band is that they played punk rock on acoustic instruments, folk punk, if you will, and they were buskers. They were street singers. Wow, okay, I'm into street singers. I'll go up there. It was only about a 90-minute drive from where I was. And we did the interview in the street, and they demonstrated a little bit of their street music for me, and I was very intrigued by that point. The third major pillar of my inspiration for writing the book came when I got a job offer in Los Angeles. This was now in 1984, and I did what everybody does when they move to LA or even visits LA. I took a walk down Venice Beach boardwalk. I was vastly intrigued. I'd seen beaches on Lake Michigan, but nothing like this. So I'm walking and taking in all the sights and sounds, and it's a lot to absorb. And lo and behold, I hear a singer that sounds like Otis Redding. Really deep soul, resonant soul voice. And I look, and it's this older black man seated, playing guitar, white hair, white beard. And it turns out his name was Ted Hawkins. And the thing about Ted Hawkins is that he was good. He was genuinely good. He had, as I found out more about him, he had been institutionalized. He had been imprisoned. He had a very hard life, but had gotten his act together and played every Saturday and Sunday reliably on Venice Boardwalk, commuting from his house in Inglewood. And lo and behold, he was actually signed to Geffen Records. Here he is, more or less a street singer, but, anything can happen in L.A., and the guy who signed Beck and a number of other successful artists to Geffen Records, Tony Berg, signed Ted Hawkins. It was a one-album deal. It didn't sell a lot of records. It got a lot of press. He got to tour the world. It was certainly the best thing that ever happened to him. And so those were really the three pillars. Maxwell Street, Milwaukee, of all places, where the Violent Femmes not only busked, but were discovered busking by Chrissie Hynde and the Pretenders when they were doing a gig at a nearby theater, and they asked them to come in and play a few songs ahead of their real opening act. I kept my eyes open for street music. I attended many South by Southwest conferences. There was a singer out on it's East 6th and Brazos. You could book the time and the place. Her name was Mary Lou Lord, and she was a very credible indie rock artist who couldn't get a real official inside gig at South by Southwest. So she made year after year, she'd come and play outside. And sometimes she'd be joined by people like Billy Bragg, who himself was a busker, or Elliott Smith. So really, and a few trips to New Orleans too, where I certainly passed through Jackson Square and took a walk down Royal Street. Saw my share of Dixieland buskers, blues buskers, folk buskers. There aren't many here where I live in the California desert, and I didn't see many others in LA, but really those were the ones that got me thinking about doing this book.
When you go back and look at some of your earliest writing, the Chicago Reader piece, has your perspective on how you've thought about that tradition changed, or did you have a fully formed sort of thesis at a young age? Like, how is your point of view or your thinking about the life of a street musician and busking changed?
I always think I saw buskers as, what would be the word? I saw them as maybe breaking local ordinance. I didn't really know what the legality was. I thought that maybe they were regarded as outlaws of the sort by municipal governments. But as I went through New Orleans and Austin and Venice Boardwalk, it occurred to me that they're really enriching the experience of being outside. And in the age of people not even going to stores anymore, anything you want, you can get on Amazon. I think that they add life, they add vibrance, they add color to a community. And that, as I did the book, as I did 100 interviews for the book, people seem to agree that from subway and tube stations to downtown areas to beach boardwalks, it's a blessing to have street music. Many cities have outrightly legalized it now. And now the problem is, getting a space and respecting other people's space if they've held that space for a while. And I've noticed that buskers tend to go to the same area. One couple who busks in New Orleans told me that they remember having to get up at 3 a.m. to hold their space, which was a good space. They couldn't even really start until rush hour, until people were on the streets. But they would get there at 3 a.m. and hold their space and do nothing for like 4 hours. This is before you could even look at your iPhone for 4 hours. I talked to buskers who busk in subways and tubes along Parisian cafes, obviously Maxwell Street, Chicago, Venice Boardwalk. There was Wildman Fisher who busked on Sunset Strip and Hollywood Boulevard. People busk all over. But what I really came to see is that buskers are an asset to a community. There was even a guy that I didn't get a chance to talk to him because he's deceased, unfortunately, named Bongo Joe. His real name was George Coleman. But he played the oil drum. And when I say that, I don't mean Jamaican steel drums, calypso. I mean oil drum, just a raw oil drum. And he would bang on it. And that's how he got the name Bongo Joe. And apparently he lived nearby to where he played on Riverwalk in San Antonio. And he would actually carry the oil drum on a moped to his spot. And he had to fight various legalities. He was arrested at some point. But I think people came to see him as an asset. And not only that, but a very credible folk label called our Hooley Records in El Cerrito, East Bay, California, signed him to a one-album deal. And Bongo Joe got to make a record on the same label that you could also find Lightning Hopkins or Big Mama Thornton or various others of that sort.
Wow.
Occasionally people would know what they have in these street singers. What I really wanted to bring across in the book is that street singing is an asset. It's a colorful,
That's incredible.
Vibrant asset to a city.
Do you think about a taxonomy of street musicians in terms of people that might be making original music, versus people more just like entertaining to earn a buck? And as a corollary to that, can you articulate the tradition that this mode of performance is within? Or in other words, how far back is there an unbroken chain?
Well, to answer your second question first, busking goes back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, I found. Obviously, I don't go back that far, but there was a pre-existing book on busking that's very fine called Buskers, published in 1981, at first I was upset. The book already exists, but it was published in 1981, and it took a slightly different approach, and it was far more oriented to the history of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Shakespeare in the Park, Benjamin Franklin, who knew, and an orator, obviously a statesman, but a musician and singer at times. So it goes way back. And I tried to briefly recapitulate that history before I went to the present day. And by the present day, I mean, my book starts about 1920 with Blind Lemon Jefferson in Dallas and Reverend Gary Davis in Durham, North Carolina, and some of the pre-World War II blues artists. And it also goes to an era that I was a little too young for, and it was hard to find eyewitnesses. It wasn't that long ago, but Doo-Wop singing groups, R&B singing groups. There weren't many of those players alive that I could find, but I did find Jay Siegel of the Tokens. There were black vocal groups. There were Italian, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, Johnny Maestro come to mind. And here was a Jewish one, Jay Siegel from the Tokens, talking about how they used to play on Rockaway Beach. And I actually have a friend in common with Mike Stoller of Lever and Stoller, the duo that wrote several hits for Elvis Presley. And I found a way to talk to him. And he was telling me, well, first of all, we didn't write doo-wop, we wrote R&B. And second of all, I never saw a group on the street corners, but I certainly did hear enough of them rehearsing in the men's room at the Brill Building, where a lot of the recording and A&R and songwriting got done for that era of pop music. So I decided to include men's rooms in my definition of busking. Anything but stages, really. I have beaches, I have tubes and subways, I have streets, I have curbs and river walks, and now I have a men's room as well.
Non-traditional public performing spaces.
That's right.
Yeah. Is the definition of a busker or a street musician, is it generally synonymous with subsistence living, or were these people that do this as a hobby? Like, how should a reader or someone listening to us think about the profile of this musician? Or is that too general of a way to think about it?
It is definitely a living. And, I was very happy. I mentioned Blind Arvella Gray from Maxwell Street. When I finally saw his apartment, I was delighted that he lived in relative comfort. A street singer living on quarters and dimes that people threw into his Dixie cup. I was gratified to see that he didn't live in splendor. He was blind, but he lived in a very nice, apartment, Chicago style, brownstone. And a lot of these buskers are very savvy business people. They're buskers, but nowadays, especially, It's not just about the quarters or the dollar bills that are thrown into guitar cases. It's QR codes. It's a PayPal and Venmo. It's social media. Hey, I will be playing in the Boston Commons between 1 and 3 today. Come on down. Here's my barcode. And people come down, and sometimes they might even pay in advance. So it's become a livelihood. There are quite a few people I wish I'd gotten into the book, but there's one that I've gotten to know on social media named Ilana Katz. That's KATZ times 2. Ilana Katz. And she's the queen of social media. She's all over Instagram. She also designs clothing that she sells out there and sells her CDs. It's quite an industry. She will announce to her fans that she's going to be at Boylston Street. I don't know Boston that well, but like a Friday at 3:00, Friday rush hour, come on down. And people do. And so people seem to make a living this way. You asked earlier about original versus cover material. And it's funny, I was doing a book festival for this book, 29 Palms Book Festival. About 500 people attended, bigger than I thought. One of the days of this festival also coincided with the 29 Palms Farmers Market. And there was a busker, I guess you could call him that, out front, playing electric guitar, kind of smooth jazz style. And he had a backing track. You could hear the bass, you could hear the drums. He's sitting there, and I gave him $1. But I asked myself, does this really count? Certain people are playing their hearts out. They can play cover songs, but this seemed to be play by numbers. I just wasn't really impressed that this fit my definition of busking.
Can you walk by a busker without throwing $1 in?
No, these days I'm very conscious of good busker karma. I mean, I was in the Tommy Bahamas store in Palm Desert the other day, and there was a guy, again, playing to a backing track and kind of smooth jazz, but I not only threw him $1, but I held up my phone with a picture of my book cover, and in case he was interested in acquiring that. I came across some buskers in Nashville. I was at the Americana Music Awards, and right outside the Ryman Auditorium was a couple of busking. And they were taking a break, so I introduced myself and threw a few bucks and told them about my book. Fine if they buy it, fine if they don't, but I was happy to support them and thank them for what they were doing.
I'm curious about something that I think you're uniquely able to comment on, one, because of the journalism you've done around this topic, but also your career.
Right.
It's the dialogue and the give and take between the street musicians and what I'll call, in air quotes, the mainstream music business. I have a few questions that to get into with that.
Please, yeah.
One thing I'm curious about is what you know or what you came to learn about how street performance and the Chicago blues sound fit together. Was there a progression? What did that look like? And who might the key figures have been?
I can answer that. Maxwell Street goes a lot farther back than Blind Arvella Gray. In fact, he was one of the final artists to play before the neighborhood got gentrified. And don't get me started on that. I think that was an awful mistake. Maxwell Street could have been what Beale Street is to current-day Memphis, or what Bourbon or Royal Streets are to current-day New Orleans, or what East 6th Street is to Austin. But Maxwell goes way back, a lot farther than I go back. It was first populated by the Eastern European, mainly Jewish immigrants in the 40s. But by the late 40s, it had become very black. You could see Muddy Waters, young Muddy Waters playing there. Chuck Berry actually played there. Who else? Little Walter, often called the Coltrane of the blues harmonica, played Maxwell Street. This is long before my time. This is the late 40s now. There was a record store that had to get into the music business because there was a demand for 78s by Little Walter and Johnny Young. So I heard a funny story. Like I said, there are all kinds of people I would have liked to have gotten into the book. And if I do a volume 2, I know exactly. I have a running list of artists I will do. But one of them, Bobby Rush, I happened to see at the Blues Music Awards in Memphis this year. I went this past May, and I told him about my book. And he gave me a funny story about Maxwell Street. So he had played a blues bar on Chicago's South Side all night, and bars in Chicago close on weekends at 5 a.m. So he loaded up his equipment and didn't even stop at his apartment. He went straight to Maxwell Street. It's now about 6 a.m. And who's walking down the street but B.B. King, who's not yet a superstar, but he too is in the late 40s, early 50s, probably the early 50s by now. He's walking down Maxwell Street, and Bobby Rush knows him and says, "Hey, BB, you want to sit in with me?" And BB says, "I'd love to. It'll cost you $50 though." So they played for a couple of hours, and they made a total of $55 in tips. And, right off the bat, 50 of that went to BB, and Bobby Rush and his band split the remaining 5. That's his busking story, and there are a lot of great ones.
That's incredible. What about the connection between the doo-wop and the streets? My understanding is that doo-wop was really shaped by the places it was performed. Non-amplified music, the voices in a circle or in a line. Like,
Right.
can you talk about that? Music probably would not exist if not for its street roots. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, doo-wop. I mentioned before, very rooted in the streets. Basically, high school students on their way home, stopping at a populated street corner in Bronx or Harlem or Philadelphia or the South Side of Chicago, the Dells. The Dells are a perfect example. They're from Chicago. I know a little more about them than I know some of the New York or Philadelphia or Baltimore or even Los Angeles doo-wop groups. So the Dells had several hits, and you can hear the doo-wop progression all the way up to being a slick soul group, really. Stay in My Corner was a doo-wop song. Oh, What a Night by the Dells, another real doo-wop song. I mean, they added some instruments in the studio, but you can hear the doo-wop harmonies. You can hear the street corner well up as you listen to those songs on the radio. By the time I was in junior high or high school, they had a pop hit called There Is. Maybe it only got played in Chicago, but it was a slicker soul song. And that was my first impression of the Dells. Then I went back in time and heard their harmonies, and you could hear them in the streets of Harvey, Illinois, a south suburb of Chicago where they used to play after school.
What about the performers who seem to move back and forth between their sort of what I would call club careers and going back out to busk? You talked about a few of those artists in the book. What kept them coming back to that life?
There's one of my favorite stories in the book was an artist named Fantastic Negrito, who has won, I'd say about 3 Grammys, perhaps a few Blues Music Awards and an Americana Music Award. So he's got quite a career now. But his career didn't start as Fantastic Negrito. His real name is Xavier. He's from Oakland, California, inner city Oakland. Somehow or other, he got up an act that sounded a little like Prince, maybe a little bit of Prince and a little bit of hip hop. And he got signed to Interscope Records. And if you get signed to Interscope Records about late 80s, you're going to be a star. I mean, just ask Dr. Dre, Snoop, Nine Inch Nails, Eminem. If you got signed to Interscope, that's the big time. But it didn't work for Xavier, this artist from Oakland. So he got booted off the label and went back to Oakland, California, and became a pop farmer. But he missed music, so he would go out to the streets of Oakland and play, and found that he had a whole different sound and a whole different persona. Instead of being Xavier, the artist, a little like Prince, he was now a Fantastic Negrito, playing kind of a folk blues, kind of his own riff on folk and blues. He went back to his roots. I don't think he was really thinking acoustically until he heard himself busk. And he was doing that really just for pleasure, for passion, for purpose. I don't think he was expecting to become a star from it, but that was what finally elevated him, not to the height of Dr. Dre or Snoop commercially, but certainly to the point where he could win Grammys in the blues category or Blues Music Awards or such. And he is touring them. I finally had a chance to meet him in Nashville when he was receiving his Americana not Lifetime Achievement, but an Americana Award.
We'll be back with more Spotlight on and Cary Baker right after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonarm.com, our new online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tone Arm, On You Sound's Adrian Sherwood reminisces about his work with Style Scott and Dub Syndicate. Read an excerpt from the book Key Changes, The 10 Times Technology Transformed the Music Industry, in advance of our live stream with the authors. Guitarist Greg Lisher of Camper Van Beethoven describes his new electronic direction. And Lawrence looks back on the most listened to episodes from year 3 of Spotlight On. You'll find all this and more at The Tone Arm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonarm.com. The Tone Arm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. Something that I think you've really done as a service is you've opened the aperture of like, this is not a New York and London phenomenon, or you talked about a lot of U.S. cities when you were speaking earlier, but you've given exposure to the idea this is a global phenomenon, not even just a Western phenomenon. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've learned in your travels and what are some of the common elements that you might find in street music around the world, and are there any sort of peculiarities that are regional?
Let me qualify that I really didn't write about busking throughout the world. I'm sure that you can go to Sydney. I'm sure that you can go to Beijing, Singapore, all kinds of places. But I kind of limited my scope to North America. including Canada, maybe not so much Mexico, and in Europe, as it turns out, because a lot of the artists that I think were key buskers, or even ones that even American artists as expatriates. A couple of stories there. I did talk to a few British people, one of whom was Billy Bragg. And Billy told me that he now plays major festivals and theaters, of course. But if he doesn't get a sound check, that's no problem. He always was able to wing it on the streets. He can wing it on stage. It might just take a little bit of tuning and peg turning, twirling, and suddenly he's in tune. He learned the spontaneity of that by busking in London. I had a few artists who were Americans who went to London and went to Paris to busk. Mojo Nixon, who sadly died soon after I interviewed him, was telling me that he wanted to join the Clash after college. I don't know if he was being flippant, funny self or what, but maybe in his mind's eye, he wanted to join the Clash. At any rate, he went to Britain and started playing in the Tube. And Madeleine Peyroux, who was a jazz singer, has several excellent albums, laid-back acoustic vocal jazz. She was raised by kind of a bohemian hippie single mom who took her to Paris during her childhood and took her to Cannes for the festival and basically told her, hey, sink or swim. Sing for these people, see what you can do. And she was singing in front of French Parisian cafes, and that's really how she cut her teeth. Coincidentally, in Paris, she met, I'm sure, a lot of French musicians, but she met an American musician, name escapes me, but somebody who played with Dylan, who was an actual Dylan contemporary, who was now in Paris, and somehow had a lot of money, enough to have his own boat and his own Mercedes-Benz. So whereas she was used to thumbing a ride or walking or taking Parisian tubes or subways, she was now riding to her gigs in a barge and a Mercedes-Benz. And she also told me that during the pandemic, busking saved her and probably saved a lot of people. I know I was starved for concerts as a concert goer, starved for seeing faces out there. But she lives in New York, and she would go out into the streets where it was safe enough to, at a distance, to busk for people. And she missed playing, and it kept her creative juices flowing. And it probably did a lot for the people who felt isolated. That all the concerts were canceled and all the live events. Just to have that kind of eye to eye, human contact with a busker was life saving on both sides.
Given the nature of social media and all of us having a production studio in our pocket, I would think that it's changed a little bit the nature of busking, in that for probably the majority of the form's history, it's been by its very nature ephemeral and potentially undocumented. I'm wondering what change about that, are in both the musicians and the passersby, but also, like, what's the role of documentary in your book? Was it important to you to, beyond just documenting busking as a mode of performance, preserving the people as well? I wonder if you could talk about that.
As far as the recording studio aspect, a few great busking albums were made on streets, but not recently. I think people just haven't thought about it. It would be a great way to make a record, to capture an artist on the streets. A few great ones were made. I wish I'd recorded Arvella Gray on Maxwell Street. You can actually find on YouTube a few videos of him doing so, and they're pretty fascinating. One of the artists that I dealt with, named Cortelia Clark, was a Chicago-born blind black blues singer, not unlike Arvella Gray in a way, who migrated down to Nashville and played in front of the F.W. Woolworth downtown.
Wow.
And I love this because it parallels my experience. I never saw Cortelia Clark, but there was a white Nashville kid named Mike Wiesner who used to go shopping with his mother to F.W. Woolworth's. And lo and behold, there's this busker playing blues and gospel named Cortelia Clark. And just like I introduced myself to Arvella Gray, Mike Wiesner introduced himself to Cortelia Clark. Turns out that Mike Wiesner grew up to be a semi-well-known record producer, and Cortelia Clark was still out there on the streets. So when Mike Wiesner had entree to, say, RCA Records Nashville Music Row office, he went there and said, would you like to sign this street singer? It plays out in front of F.W. Woolworth's on Fifth Avenue North in Nashville. And of course, they thought he was crazy. RCA Nashville was the label of Chet Atkins, Elvis Presley. Why do this street singer? But he actually communicated the documentary nature of this project, and they recorded him on the streets. And lo and behold, and this is great, the album got nominated for a Grammy Award in the folk category because, the folk category was unpoliced. It was under the radar. Nobody really campaign to get an artist a Grammy in the folk category. But if you worked for RCA Nashville or Columbia Nashville or Warner Brothers Nashville, you could gather your employees and in a memo say, hey, when you vote in the Grammys, be sure to vote for this in the folk category this time for this artist named Cordelia Clark. The folk nominations come out in 1967, and lo and behold, there's Cordelia Clark in the folk category. And also there is, I believe, check me up on this, but I think Judy Collins and a few other real folk artists, real folk legends, and 2 or 3 of them. And then oddly enough, another blind street singer, a white blind blues singer from New York named Oliver Smith, who had a similar discovery playing in Midtown Manhattan, and an A&R scout for Elektra Records, which was very independent at the time and mainly a folk label, happened to be walking home from work and heard the street singer and went back to Elektra and got Jack Holtzman, the owner of Elektra, to come out and see this guy. And Jack said, yeah, let's record him. So we recorded that afternoon. An album was made right on the spot, and that singer was never heard from again. The album was released. It was on Elektra Records, and it too was in the category folk that year. So it was a very potent category for buskers, the folk category that year. I believe Oliver Smith's album was recorded on the streets as well, and Cordelia Clark. Bongo Joe, who I mentioned before, the oil drum player in San Antonio, recorded on the streets. I think there's not enough of that going on, but there is one organization that I conclude with in the book called Playing for Change, run by a guy named Mark Johnson, has really made a mission of saving street singing, saving busking, and they really have gone all over the world. And whereas I used Zoom, I used telephones, I used email, I did very little traveling. They have actually taken cameras physically to wherever the buskers are, and that includes Africa. So they, Playing for Change supports buskers, supports the homeless. It's a very good cause. It's ongoing. It's an organization. It's a foundation. I believe the owner lives in Venice, California, where you can see a busker or two within about a 5-minute walk of his house. Playing for Change is a great organization. There was another label run by a guy who ran several labels in the 80s and 90s. He's retired now here in the California desert. He was going to start a busking TV series, but that got foiled, unfortunately, during the pandemic and just never picked up again. But, there are some people like Playing for Change that care about street music. I conclude the book by thanking Mark Johnson, the guy from Playing for Change, for taking an hour to talk to me on the phone. And I conclude the book with his quote after that, which is, hey, thank you. I could talk about street singers all day. So it was nice to meet a kindred spirit in that respect, somebody who's done so much for the medium of street singing.
What's really incredible about the work they do is, on the one hand, the pairing of the street musicians with the celebrity, and that construct is just so clever and beautiful. But the other piece is the level of production quality. Like when you watch one of their videos, you could see the mainstream music performer whose song they're doing, and then you can see these folks from all around the world. And it's like it's the same beautiful video quality.
That's right.
The locations that they're in, just by the very nature of going to their spaces, it's really kind of striking. Like they're very beautiful.
They are. I mean, especially their, I think the most famous song is Stand By Me, the old Benny King R&B song that shows singers from all over the world singing simultaneously to it. That was and that, I think, raised a lot of money for their cause as well. It certainly became a hit video and a hit on YouTube.
It's really neat. I love the idea of a busker TV show. That seems like it's ready-made for YouTube. Somebody's waiting to be a YouTube celebrity doing that.
Oh, I had lunch with the guy doing it in the past year, and it doesn't seem like he has any aspirations of taking it up again. But somebody ought to. I think it'd be a great TV show and a great documentary. And if anyone wants to work with me on a documentary, documentaries are hard. The visa clearances are not easy to accomplish. There are a lot of factors involved. It takes a lot of budget, but I would love to consult such an endeavor. I think this would be a great documentary. And there's a lot of old footage. I mean, obviously a lot of buskers, a lot of people in my book were deceased, but thank God for a lot of eyewitnesses, at least for buskers in the 20th and 21st centuries.
You mentioned earlier about coming across some YouTube footage from Market Street, and I wonder, were you able to find any documentary evidence of some of the personalities that you knew only by name?
First of all, there's a documentary about Ted Hawkins on Venice Boardwalk. Secondly, there's a documentary about Maxwell Street called And This Is Maxwell Street, ... and This Is Maxwell Street, which you can find it on YouTube. Check it out. So at least those two I know about. And there's a lot more. I really can't think of any major documentaries of artists documented on the street. I think it's wide open, but if you look for it, if you YouTube search for people who have known to be buskers on the streets, you will find various YouTubes of them. Most of it's very low fidelity, which I like about it, of course.
Yeah, I had it in my head that there might have been people with early like Super 8 cameras or whatever taking them out and about, just shooting stuff, and that would be fun to find.
Well, I was watching the Yacht Rock documentary like everybody else was in the last week, and it occurred to me how street music is really the antithesis of yacht rock in so many ways, down to the name Yacht Rock. I think what I really like about it is the spontaneity of it, the fact that it is low fidelity, the fact that anybody can go out and do it, and you either sink or swim. If you're good, you get a following sometimes. And so much of it has to do with dumb luck. The Violent Femmes might have still been out there in Milwaukee if Chrissie Hynde and James Honeyman Scott of the Pretenders hadn't been doing a gig at a nearby theater. They've got a little bit of time after sound check. They check out this band and ask them to be the opening act for the opening act. Or like I said, Ted Hawkins being discovered by a Geffen Scout producer, actually an A&R executive. Some of that is just dumb luck. I mean, there are a lot of buskers whose names we'll never know in every city who lived and died. I mean, I knew a lot of them on Maxwell Street. I actually made a point to, if I didn't know their name, I would ask them, or I would ask somebody, hey, who's that? And I would be told, oh, that's little Pat Rushing. Oh, okay. That's Maxwell Street Jimmy Davis. That's Blind Jim Brewer. That's, and there were a lot of others where Arvella Gray came from. But Arvella Gray is the one who meant most to me and really guided me, gave me inspiration throughout this process. He died in 1980. We'd fallen out of touch. I was in college around then. I'd like to think that I helped him and helped Busking a little bit by getting his phone number and writing that article for the Reader and then making that record. It's not like that record was a bestseller. I don't care. It's not like this book will be a bestseller. I don't care. But it's out there. And I did both of them for love of music that's a little bit homespun, a little bit lo-fi, a little bit spontaneous, imperfect. I mean, I like perfect music too. And like I said, the Yacht Rock documentary, I was really grooving to Steely Dan and Michael McDonald. So I like all kinds of music. But there's something about street music that really sends me, and I will sit and watch a busker forever. I was coming out of a yoga class here in the California desert, La Quinta, which is a pretty refined little suburb of Palm Springs in Indio. And in the parking lot is a guy sitting there with a little dog playing a violin. Just instrumentals, and he's got his violin case open. So I put $5 in the case and took a few pictures from him and put them on my Instagram, and I was happy to do that for him. I couldn't do much more. And, I see buskers, like I said, who are, live to track and not so spontaneous, playing kind of smooth jazz. Not my thing, but I still appreciate sitting outside and the amount of nerve it has just to really be within spitting distance of your audience.
I think that's an element of it that you've articulated well that gives me that jolt every time I come across someone doing it as well. It's just the balls, to be out there. And something you alluded to earlier, to be in sort of like a quasi-legal environment, like there's an element of like there may be at risk because you don't really, especially if you're in a town you don't know how tolerated it is. I always get a little fear for them of like, well, their money's on the ground. Like, are they vulnerable? It's very much the living outside the mainstream romanticism that's easy to overlay on it as the observer.
Well, Marilyn Lord was very, told me a lot of stories. An attractive young female, for one thing, out in the London Tube or in the French subways. And she told me of a kind of a suspicious looking guy who was hanging around. I think she described him as one-armed. He eventually urinated in her guitar case, took a pee in her guitar case. And by then she felt she'd seen everything. I'm sure that there are those who get robbed. I mean, it's very easy to reach down when an artist is playing guitar and pilfer $35 that might be, hard-earned money in a musician's guitar case. There are all kinds of things, all kinds of risks that these guys took. One of my favorite is Peter Case, who's a pretty respected singer-songwriter. And prior to being a solo singer-songwriter, he was in a kind of new wave band called the Plimsouls, who had a couple of early alternative rock hits and were signed to Geffen. And before that, he was in a band called The Nerves. But he was a guy from Buffalo. I think just after high school, put his thumb out on the highway and hitchhiked to San Francisco from Buffalo, a long hitchhike. Right there, you're putting yourself in danger, even in an age where hitchhiking was a little maybe safer than it is now. And he made his way to San Francisco and was homeless. Completely homeless. So here's this guy who probably came from in the middle class enough background, but a rebel, and had this dream and went to San Francisco, went to a junkyard and found a car, an abandoned rusty car, and that was his home. That's where he slept. He found a place to take showers, and he would busk every day, either on Fisherman's Wharf or sometimes out by the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. And he told me, he met all kinds of San Francisco characters. What's his name? Allen Ginsberg came out of the City Lights bookstore and sat in with him. They'd never met, but, he knew who Allen Ginsberg was, and Allen Ginsberg sat in. There are all kinds of stories like that, all kinds of people who, Wildman Fisher was probably not out of school by calling him mentally ill. He was called that by many people who have written about him or spoke to me about him. He had some issues, and he was in Los Angeles and would busk out and sometimes just spontaneous bellowing, and you could tell that he had some issues. He had a song, I used to be shy, but I'm not shy anymore, and he would just recite that ceaselessly. And Frank Zappa found him, and Frank Zappa was starting a label for other weird artists in addition to himself that he would find in weird or unusual or unconventional artists. So he signed Wildman Fisher to his Bizarre, or maybe it was Straight. He had two labels, Bizarre, Straight Records. He also signed the GTOs, who were groupies. And I know one of the GTOs, former groupie known as Miss Pamela DeBar. She's actually a friend of mine, and I attend parties, great parties in her backyard in the San Fernando Valley. I drive in to town for those.
Mm-hmm.
And she was telling me about Wildman Fisher and how he would sometimes just bellow. But it turns out that the GTOs, or her band of groupies, and Wildman Fisher had a gig together at a place that sounds a little ambitious. Maybe there was a third, or maybe there was a headliner on the act, but this was the Shrine Auditorium in LA, best known for the Grammys and the Oscars at some point before they went to different venues. And Wildman Fisher was on stage doing his Wildman Fisher act, and actually left the stage, walked through the theater, and continued to sing outside the theater. Everybody's still in their seats, but he's outside singing. And a few people followed him to see where he went. And he preferred the outdoors to the indoors. Here he is in a very legitimate Los Angeles theater. So you have all kinds, and it was great to hear all these stories. I'm sorry that I didn't get to see some of these things with my own eyes and ears.
Yeah. You mentioned early on about the changes to Maxwell Street, which we could do an hour just talking about the changes in American cities and what that's done to various cultural groups and the arts.
Right.
There's something else you referred to, was the cultural significance or the additive nature of having music on the streets, and how cities have come to acknowledge that and realize it. Obviously there's a spectrum between being tolerant and actually supportive.
Mm-hmm.
And it manifests in different ways. Like I go to some cities and you see the busker have the official, some kind of like permit or pass or something. And then other places, it's clearly much more tolerated than supported. And I wonder, could you talk about, in present day, to the extent at the extremes, what would be a place that's like, this is a pretty good place to be a busker, and then a place that seems hostile and doesn't get it?
I would say the subways are probably rough, although people certainly appreciate on their way to work getting a little bit of entertainment and maybe a smile, and maybe their experience in commuting to work is a little richer. But I get the sense that New Orleans actually appreciates what they have. It was hard fought. It didn't come naturally. I met an attorney who was a busking advocate. I didn't meet her, but I interviewed her on the phone. There was a guy from an organization that supports buskers, among other musicians, a musician advocacy group, and it's specific to New Orleans. But New Orleans has certainly found that a lot of its color, a lot of its human interest, a lot of its tourism is music. People go to New Orleans, they expect music, all different kinds, from Dixieland to R&B to whatever it is the trombone shorty does. All kinds of music, really, but they've taken stock in it. It's not even permitted anymore. It's permitted, but it's not permitted, meaning that I think you can pretty much just set up within reason. And sometimes there are laws in terms of decibels or amplification or drums. But I think the cities are finding that they are richer for it. Like I say, in this day and age of being able to order almost anything from Amazon, what's going to bring people to stores? And maybe they go to the big box store that's on the edge of town. What's going to bring them to the downtown section? Maybe their offices are there, but a lot of people telecommute. Why go downtown? Why go to 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica? Why go to the Drag in Austin, or South Congress in Austin? It's the experience. It's the community of being among members of your species. And what makes that richer than performance and music? I've seen poets, I've seen orators, but there's something about music that really makes you smile, makes you feel a little better about humanity, makes you feel a little better about your day, makes you feel a little bit better about being downtown and seeing a lot of for rent signs and storefronts. So I think cities are taking stock. I wish my hometown of Chicago had taken stock on Maxwell Street. And in fact, there is a makeshift ersatz new Maxwell Street that isn't really on Maxwell Street. It's on Des Plaines Street. I don't know. I've been there once. It didn't really impress me. I think there were some musicians, not blues, but the city has evolved. The city is Latino now. The city is all kinds of things, and there were all kinds of musicians representing a rainbow of ethnicities and backgrounds. But it wasn't Maxwell Street with the old decrepit buildings and the famous deli that was on the Blues Brothers and the record store where you could buy little Walter 78s for $1. To have experienced that at age 16 was priceless, and I probably wouldn't have if not for a father who grew up experiencing that and really thought he was taking me slumming. And in effect, maybe he was, but it changed my life, and I hope maybe I changed a life or two. If Arvella Gray got a coffee house gig or two as a result of this, or if he got a few more interviews to do, if he got into Chicago TV news, if I could have helped accomplish any of that, then and with this book, if I can help bring a little bit of consciousness and appreciation for life on the streets. I'm a city kid. I live in the California desert now, in a gated community, and not exactly a city street. But when I walk through Palm Springs and I see an old man with an accordion doing Lady of Spain and the accordion, I just sort of smile and give him $1. I love street life. I love walking downtowns of cities, and long may there be downtowns and long may there be busking.
Thank you so much, Cary Baker. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.